By way of self-introduction, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Our foundation, thank you. As many of you know, FFF is devoted to presenting an uncompromising moral, philosophical, and economic case for the libertarian philosophy. I graduated with an economics degree from Virginia Military Institute, went on to get a law degree from the University of Texas, practiced law for about 12 years, and then shifted gears and went into the educational arena in libertarian philosophy. And we've published many books at FFF, but the ones that I've authored that I'm really proud of are the Kennedy Autopsy, Regime Change, the JFK Assassination, and the Evil of the National Security State. In 1954, the CIA published a top-secret classified document called A Study of Assassination. And by reading this document, it's clear that by this time, 7 years after the CIA had been called into existence with the National Security Act of 1947, that this agency was specializing in the art of assassination, how to kill people. And among the fascinating parts of this memorandum, this study, are that the CIA was not only trying to figure out the best, most expeditious ways to kill people, but they were also trying to figure out how to do so in a way where people would not suspect that they committed the assassination, or at least could not prove that they committed the assassination. Now, if we jump ahead 10 years and we go into the 60s and 70s and we move over to the School of the Americas, which many Latin Americans call the School of Assassins. This was the Pentagon's military training school, especially for military officials from Latin America that were part of right-wing military dictatorships, some of which the U.S. government had installed into power. We find that at that school they were teaching these military officials in the art of assassination. They also were teaching them in the art of torture. They had torture manuals that they used for the torture course. But one of the fascinating aspects of the assassination program was how it had developed from 1954. Because one of the principles that they were teaching was that when you're committing a state assassination, you're killing somebody, and you don't want people to focus attention on you as the assassin, that a great technique is to blame it on a communist. Now, why a communist? Why not blame it on a capitalist or a doctor or, accountant, a businessman? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to 1945. World War II had just ended. The United States and the Allied powers had defeated Nazi Germany. But U.S. officials said to the American people, you just can't rest. We now have a new enemy that is arguably more powerful than the enemy we just defeated. And this new enemy is our World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union, and specifically the communist-controlled Soviet Union, which had been communist-controlled since World War I. The idea was, they told Americans, there is a worldwide communist conspiracy, and it's based in Moscow, Russia. And this conspiracy entails communists that are hell-bent on conquering the world, including the United States. And in order to prevent this from happening, they said it's going to be necessary to alter the structure of the American government from what was called a limited government republic that the Constitution had called into existence, where government's powers are limited, they're enumerated, they're out in the open, to what is called a national security state, which is a totalitarian type of government where the government officials are able to operate essentially omnipotent powers, unlimited powers, mostly in secret. Now, as part of this idea that communists were coming to get us, they also talked in terms of the dangers of the philosophy of communism. that this was a very destructive philosophy, that it was like a narcotic, a siren song, the idea that government should be taking care of people, that government should be taking from the rich and giving to the poor. And that when people got a taste of this philosophy, they tend to want more of it. They want government to take care of them to a larger extent. And so you had this twin threat that became part of the Cold War. The communists are coming to get us, and this philosophy is threatening to envelop us. And as part of what became known as the anti-communist crusade, the entire national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, began monitoring people's activity and harassing them and infiltrating the organizations, especially leftist organizations, because there was a fine line between being a leftist or a liberal or progressive and being a socialist and a communist. So a lot of the leftist organizations were being infiltrated. And of course the Communist Party was, but then there was also an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was just a national organization that was saying, we want normal relations with Cuba. And then, of course, there was the Civil Rights Movement. Martin Luther King was suspected to be a communist. The Civil Rights Movement was considered to be a communist front that was going to lead the communists into America. And we're all familiar with Dalton Trumbo and the Hollywood 10, where careers were ruined. The McCarthy hearings, that infamous question that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who had ever had any exposure to communism. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? I mean, they were destroying careers. They're destroying lives. People were scared to death. And so it is within this context that the strategy starts to make sense. Blame it on a communist, because if you blame it on a communist, if you start to question the official version, if you start pointing the finger at the government, they can turn around and say, you're a leftist pinko, you're obviously a communist sympathizer, and it certainly tends to diminish the incentive among leftists who have had socialist proclivities from going down that road. Now, this study of assassination in '54 didn't occur in a vacuum. It occurred in the middle of a regime change, as part of a regime change operation in Guatemala. It was one of the first ones, the first one being in '53 with Mossadegh in Iran. But you see, what had happened in Guatemala is the Guatemalan people had the temerity to democratically elect, in a legitimate election, a self-avowed socialist, a communist. A person who believed that, hey, we're going to take money from the rich and we're going to give it to the poor, and this is the salvation to poverty. And in fact, he starts taking, the president, Jacobo Arbenz, starts taking land from a giant U.S. corporation called United Fruit that had major connections to the CIA and to members of Congress, and he starts distributing them to the poor, to the peasants in Guatemala. Well, this turns all kinds of alarm bells on in Washington. My gosh, a communist that's been democratically elected? And then it's when Arbenz starts reaching out to the Soviet Union and he says, I don't care about the Cold War. I'll establish friendly relations with y'all. I want to establish peace with y'all and with Cuba. I have nothing against Cuba. And that sealed his fate. At that point, he was deemed a grave threat to U.S. national security. And then when he was caught smuggling and importing weapons from Czechoslovakia, which was a Soviet satellite state, that did it. Now, it wasn't really always clear what the theory here was like, was he going to take these weapons and take the Guatemalan army up through Mexico and down across Brownsville and take over Texas and then the United States? Nobody ever made that clear. But the idea was, we need to target him for a regime change operation. One of these omnipotent powers that's not listed in the Constitution. Now, note something important here. Guatemala never attacked the United States or even threatened to attack the United States. And as part of this regime change operation, the CIA comes up with a assassination list of people that they or their proxies who are going to start this regime change operation was okay to assassinate. Amazing. Now, if we jump ahead some 20 years or so, 1970 to 73, we go to Chile, which is even further away from the United States. Oh, by the way, they succeeded in that regime change operation. They ousted Arbenz from power. Luckily, he was able to get out without being assassinated. But in Chile, the Chilean people do the same thing. They have the temerity to democratically elect, in a long democratic tradition in this country, a self-avowed socialist, communist. He was a physician. He was an intellectual. His name was Salvador Allende, and he made no bones about it. And so he wins a plurality, and the Congress is getting ready to confirm him as president, and all the alarm bells go off in Washington again. Uh-oh, here we are again. Another communist, democratically elected. This is not good. And then Allende makes it even worse because he's there talking about his, wants to establish friendship with the Soviet Union. He's got nothing against Russia, Moscow. He later invites Fidel Castro to Chile to visit the country. Well, that sealed his fate. Now it's Allende who's deemed a threat to national security. And so the order is given. Regime change. The CIA goes in, they try to bribe the members of Congress so that they don't vote for Allende to confirm him as president. That doesn't work. So they start talking about a coup, a military coup to take control and prevent Allende from coming into power. But there's one big obstacle, and that's a man named General Rene Schneider, who is the overall commanding general of Chile's armed forces. And Schneider, a man of impeccable integrity. He's a family, he's got a couple of sons, and he says to U.S. officials, it ain't going to happen. I'm a soldier. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of my country. It provides only for impeachment or elections to oust a president from office. It does not provide for a military coup. End of story. Well, the CIA's position was different. They're here telling Rene Schneider and the rest of the military intelligence establishment, the national security establishment of this country, look, you have a moral duty to save this country. The country's going down with Allende. It's going to go down with communism. It's going to go down with socialism when he starts adopting all these programs. And it doesn't matter. Don't tell us technicalities of your Constitution and what the law says. Because if the country goes down, what good's your Constitution? You have a moral duty as a national security establishment to save your country by violently ousting your president from office and taking control and saving the country. Schneider stands his ground. So a conspiracy arises within Washington, Virginia, or both, in which the decision is made to kidnap Schneider violently and remove him from the scene. Now, the CIA has always denied that the conspiracy involved murdering him, but they lied about every other aspect of the Chile operation, and the denials ring false. Because what else could they have done? They kidnapped the guy, the coup takes over, and what are they going to do, return him to society? There wasn't any chance of that. And in fact, the kidnapping attempt takes place. The CIA smuggles in under diplomatic pouch 2 high-powered weapons. Schneider is armed. He's a general, and he fights back against the kidnappers, and they shoot him dead. And so the obstacles removed, and over a 3-year period of time, the CIA is stirring up things in the country, bribing truckers not to deliver food, and creating all kinds of chaos and crises, along with Allende's socialist policies, which, not surprisingly, were also causing chaos and crises, much as they are in Venezuela today. And so all this leads to a coup where the national security establishment is attacking the president with missiles from the Air Force jets and infantry surrounding his position. And Allende is fighting back with small arms fire with some supporters, but he ends up dead, apparently committed suicide. General Pinochet takes power, proceeds to round up tens of thousands of people, kidnapping them, putting them into military dungeons, raping them, his forces were, committing the most gruesome sexual acts against the women that you can even imagine, disappearing them or executing them, including 2 Americans with the complicity of U.S. intelligence agents. And the idea was, and the U.S. was flooding Pinochet's regime with foreign aid at this point. They thought he was fantastic, that what he was doing to all these people was wonderful because they were communists. You see, I mean, if they're communists, it's no problem doing this because this is a Cold War. Now, obviously, the U.S. wasn't doing this to communists in America. They were just surveilling them and harassing them and destroying their careers. In Chile, he was going all the way. He was killing communists. And by the way, communists were still killing U.S. troops in Vietnam at this time. So it was all considered war. Now, if we go into the middle period in between 54 and 70, 73, and we go into 59, there's a man named Fidel Castro that is taking power in Cuba. Now, we hear about a lot of Castro's dictatorship, but we don't hear much about the man he ousted from power, who was one of the most brutal, corrupt dictators in the world. His name was Fulgencio Batista. And to give you a type of man he was, he entered into a partnership with the mafia to run the casinos in Havana. The mafia, as we all know, is this murderous, blackmailing, extortion, criminal organization. And he gets a cut of the action in return for this. And to give you a real measure of the man, he has his police forces rounding up little girls, minors, and bringing them into Havana, out in the villages. He'd bring them into Havana to serve as sexual favors for men, well-heeled businessmen who were gamblers at the Havana casinos that were coming in from the United States. Well, not surprisingly, a lot of the Cubans didn't like this. And if you objected, you'd find yourself in a dungeon, tortured, executed. He was a brutal dictator. But the revolution starts. And it really wasn't Castro that started it. He was actually in jail. It was a woman named Celia Sanchez, one of her best friends, who was a girl 12, 13 years old, that got raped as part of this process, that she said enough's enough. And she's really the woman who is celebrated in Cuban history as the starter of the revolution. But in any event, they prevail. Batista hauls out of the country with hundreds of millions of dollars or millions of dollars in state monies. Castro takes power. And it's not real clear where he stands at first. People are kind of getting the measure of this man. But he makes it very clear from the very beginning that he says, we are now independent of U.S. control. Wow. I mean, this was a shock. I mean, this raises eyebrows in Washington. I mean, Cuba had been under control from the United States from 1898, the Spanish-American War, where we had double-crossed them. I mean, we had said, we're going to help you with your independence from Spain, but after the independence is won, we forgot to tell you, we're now in control. We're now in the position of the Spanish Empire. And so the United States government had controlled Cuba all the way up to 59. And Castro says, no more. It's over. We are now independent. Well, then he starts displaying the same socialist, communist proclivities that Arbenz had displayed, that Allende would display several years later. And this causes real alarm bells to go off. Oh, my gosh. A communist 90 miles from American shores. I mean, what's Guatemala? A couple thousand miles away, and Chile would be, 8,000 or so. This is 90 miles away from American shores. This is a communist regime. This is a dagger pointed at America's throat. Now, never mind that Cuba never attacked the United States, never threatened to attack the United States, never committed one act of terrorism. They're a grave threat to, quote, national security, which by this time had become the two most important words in the American political lexicon. Well, but then Castro seals his fate. He starts reaching out to the Soviet Union. He tells U.S. oil companies operating in Cuba to refine Soviet oil, and the American officials tell the U.S. oil producers, don't refine that. That's communist oil, and everything spirals out of control. And Castro's fate is sealed. Now we got a regime change operation that would ultimately manifest itself in a partnership between the CIA and the mafia to assassinate Castro. Now, into this maelstrom comes John F. Kennedy. He had to have been present. He had to be present at Eisenhower's farewell address, where Eisenhower, ironically, who had been in charge of the Mossadegh ouster and the Arbenz ouster, tells the American people, oh, by the way, I want to warn you about something. And that's this new way of life we have here. The military-industrial complex constitutes a grave threat to your freedoms and your democratic processes. Something that the people of Guatemala had already discovered and that the people of Chile would discover. But Kennedy comes into office as pretty much your standard Cold Warrior. He had bought into all this. The communists are coming to get us, like most Americans. The communists are coming to get us. Communism is a dangerous siren song of a philosophy. It tends to seduce people into wanting more government to take care of them. And pretty much your standard Cold Warrior, not completely. But he immediately, the CIA presents him with this plan that had been brought up under Eisenhower, where the CIA had gone to Eisenhower and said, look, we got 2 successes under our belt. We got Iran, we got Guatemala, and so we can do this. We can do it again. And Eisenhower says, go for it. But they hadn't finished in time, and they really thought Nixon was going to win, so there was just going to be this continuity, but Nixon didn't win. Now, all of a sudden, the man that they considered was kind of like a neophyte, playboy, junior senator from Massachusetts. They play him, and they present this plan to him, and they say, Mr. President, we've got this all set up. The exiles are trained. There'll be no U.S. involvement. They're going to win. The Cuban people are going to rise up because they don't like Castro. And Kennedy says, let's do it. But he says, I want to make it clear there's going to be no U.S. involvement in this, except secretly. The lies were built into the plan from the beginning. And they said, no, that no U.S. support will be necessary. Well, they were playing him. They knew that that it could not succeed without U.S. support. But what they figured was that Kennedy would be trapped. That he would say, well, we can't lose face. I mean, a communist defeating the Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs, how could America tolerate that? I mean, the world would lose respect for us and the communists would be encouraged. So they knew they were manipulating him into having to provide that support. The invasion starts, the Cuban exiles are getting massacred and captured, and so they come to Kennedy and said, we were wrong, we need the air support after all, and thinking that, of course, he was going to have to say yes, and Kennedy stood his ground and said, I told you, no air support. And you told me none would be necessary. It's not coming. Well, so the Cuban exiles are defeated. Castro's crowing about this, and the whole world's marveling that the little communist army has defeated, really, a U.S. army, a trained army. And there is tremendous anger and antipathy as a result of this. The CIA and the Cuban exiles were considering Kennedy to be a betrayer, a traitor, a person that betrayed the Cuban people, that betrayed the cause of freedom, that betrayed the American people, that betrayed everything we stand for, the anti-communism. And worst of all, he had left this dagger that America could not survive with. Kennedy, for his part, was just as angry because he knew he had been played. And he had figured out, he had gotten double-crossed. And he says, I'm going to take the CIA, I'm going to tear them into 1,000 pieces, and I'm going to scatter them to the winds. Those were his words. And he does the unthinkable. He fires the much revered director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. He says, you're out of here. This guy was a World War II intelligence veteran, much revered within the agency. Kennedy says, you're out. And then to add insult to injury, he puts his brother Bobby in charge of monitoring the CIA, which they hated because they had pretty much carte blanche during the Eisenhower 8 years. So here's the war, the genesis of the war that never got any better. It only got worse. And it expands to the military. That the military is exhorting Kennedy after this, we have to invade Cuba. And they present him with this plan, Operation Northwoods, that they were totally convinced was necessary. It was a unanimous plan by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that says we're going to have, terrorist attacks by U.S. agents, secret agents, posing as communists, Cuban communists. And then when real people die, they just have to be sacrificed for the greater good. Then Kennedy's going to go on national television and say, my fellow Americans, we've been attacked. I'm going to send troops into Cuba to defend America, to defend your rights and your freedoms. The troops are going to be serving our country, and we're going to get rid of this communist regime. I mean, it was amazing because they were convinced under this Cold War mindset that America could not survive with Cuba 90 miles away. And so Kennedy, to Kennedy's everlasting credit, Kennedy says, no. And they were furious, absolutely furious. He's displaying his cowardice again like he did at the Bay of Pigs. And then comes the Cuban Missile Crisis. Here the Soviets have now put in missiles. Now we always hear from the mainstream press, these were offensive weapons. They were nothing of the sort. They were entirely defensive. If they were offensive, they would have fired them and started World War III. They never fired them. They were there for defensive purposes. Now, why? Well, because Castro had gotten wind of the fact that the military and the CIA were still demanding that Kennedy invade the island. And Castro wasn't dumb. He knew that he could defeat some Cuban exiles. There was no way he could defeat the U.S. Army any more than Saddam Hussein or any other third world impoverished country can defeat the U.S. military. Impossible. And so he figured his only chance to keep Cuba independent and to stay alive was to bring the Soviets in, bring nuclear weapons to deter a U.S. attack. Keep in mind again, Cuba had never attacked the United States, never threatened to do so. So the Soviets say, okay, but only for defense. If the U.S. invades, you got the weapons. Well, through the crisis, the military, the Pentagon, the CIA are demanding that Kennedy invade. This is your chance, Mr. President. We cannot survive with Cuba being communist, but you got an excuse now. They got weapons there aimed at the United States. Kennedy, in a moment of tremendous greatness, says, no, we're going to talk. And so he starts talking to the Soviets, and he puts his brother Bobby in charge of talking to a Soviet emissary. And Khrushchev says to Kennedy, look, you've got nuclear weapons in Turkey aimed at us, right on our borders. Why can't we have nuclear weapons aimed at you in Cuba? Kennedy sees the hypocrisy of it. Kennedy says, you're absolutely right. I'll take my missiles out of Turkey. And they said, well, okay, all we're doing here is we have our missiles because you're threatening to invade Cuba. And Kennedy says, okay, I'll give you my vow we won't invade Cuba. And they said, then we'll remove the missiles, which showed that they were defensive in purpose. And that's the deal that was cut. It shocked the military. It shocked the CIA. It's impossible to overstate their reaction. Look what Kennedy had done in one fell swoop. He had pulled the carpet out from 2 or 3 years of studies, reports, analyses, regime change operations, because they knew the only way to oust Castro from power, everything else had failed, assassination, everything, was an invasion. Suddenly, Kennedy had said, that's all over. That's why LeMay called it the greatest defeat in U.S. history. That's why he said this is appeasement of the communists. They, in their minds, Kennedy had surrendered America to the communists, that it was all over. America had lost the Cold War, that it was only a matter of time before the communists were here. Now, the mainstream media says Khrushchev blinked. Actually, he never blinked. It was Kennedy who blinked because he gave them exactly what they wanted, a pledge that there would be no invasion of Cuba, and he takes the missiles out of Turkey. And thank God he did blink, because as it turned out, what the CIA didn't know was that the Soviet commanders on the ground had armed nuclear weapons with battlefield authority to fire those weapons in the case of an invasion. There is no doubt there would have been all-out nuclear war the first time one of those missiles had been fired if Kennedy had fired the advice of the Pentagon. All of a sudden, though, Kennedy doesn't stop there. He's achieved a giant breakthrough. He starts to realize there's a lot of bunk going on here. And so he prepares this magnificent speech. I think it's one of the best speeches in presidential history, if not the best. This peace speech that he delivers at American University. And he didn't consult with the CIA. He doesn't consult with the Pentagon. He doesn't let them know what he's up to. He appears there and says, we are hereby ending the Cold War. We are going to live in peace and harmony and peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. We may not agree with their philosophy, they don't agree with ours, but we're going to get along and we're going to put an end to all this stuff. And he even proposed a joint mission to the moon, sharing missile technology with the communists who were hell-bent on destroying us. This is what had sealed Arbenzin's fate. This is what would seal Allende's fate. Reaching out to the Soviet Union, the communists, in a spirit of friendship and peace. And then he enters into the nuclear test ban treaty over the vehement objections of the military establishment. How can we win a nuclear war if we can't test our nuclear weapons above ground and below ground? You are disarming. This is a trick by the communists to cause America to disarm. And then Kennedy does the unthinkable. He enters into personal negotiations, person-to-person negotiations with Nikita Khrushchev, back-channel negotiations with Fidel Castro, using private emissaries, totally circumventing the Pentagon, the CIA, and not telling them. And he thinks they're secret. To end the Cold War, to lift the embargo against Cuba, to establish normal relations with the communist world. He thought they were secret, but the problem was the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations that was transmitting all this to Cuba, supposedly secretly, it's a 99% certainty his phones were being tapped by the CIA or the NSA, just as they are today and just as Russia's are today, and that the CIA knew exactly what Kennedy was up to. He was selling out America to the communist world. Now, we know that all of this came to an end on November 22nd, 1963. One of the fascinating aspects of that assassination was that immediately after the assassination, it was blamed on a communist. And almost immediately, within a few hours after the assassination, there was a group in New Orleans called the DRE, composed of Cuban exiles, that immediately started publishing advertisements, press releases, advertising Lee Harvey Oswald's communist bona fides. It was a group that was being generously funded by the CIA. A fact that the CIA kept secret from the Warren Commission, kept secret from the House Select Committee, and kept secret all the way through the 1990s from the ARRB. And of course, there's all the mysteries and anomalies involved with the assassination, the autopsy, as detailed in my book, The Kennedy Autopsy, and regime change, the JFK assassination. But just unexplained things like, why would a communist, a genuine communist, join the Marine Corps that's part of an establishment that has just killed hundreds of thousands of people in North Korea a few years before? Why would a genuine communist join an organization where he might be deployed at any moment to go kill communists? Indeed, why would a communist, a genuine communist, want to kill a president who just publicly announced to the world that he wanted to establish peaceful relations with the communist world and elevate a vice president whose policies mirrored that of the Pentagon and the CIA? In any event, everything's restored to abnormal with Lyndon Johnson. Vietnam's ramped up. 58,000 American men lose their lives there. American forces are defeated. The communists didn't fall. The dominoes didn't fall. The communists didn't come to get us. Then the Cold War ends. We don't get our constitutional republic back as they promised when they established the national security state. They start poking hornets' nests in the Middle East with the Persian Gulf intervention, the killing of hundreds of thousands of children from Iraq with the sanctions. Then we get the inevitable terrorist retaliation, which is then used as the excuse to invade Iraq, to effect regime change there that the sanctions had been unable to accomplish, regime change in Afghanistan, death, destruction, forever wars, and of course, ever-increasing spending and debt that is sending our nation into bankruptcy. This is not the government that our framers and the founding fathers and our American ancestors intended to bring into existence. If they had been told that this is the type of government with the power to assassinate Americans with impunity, because the federal courts have said we're not going to touch it, they have the authority to do so, the power to torture Americans, to detain Americans unlawfully, they never would have confirmed the Constitution. So what is the solution to this? Well, it seems to me the solution is obvious. It's not a matter of getting better people in public office. It's a structural problem. It's a structure of government problem. And that what we need to do as Americans is raise our vision to a higher level. And we need to examine the principles on which this country was founded. The principles in that Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the legitimate role of government as a constitutionally limited government republic. That if we can restore that and dismantle this totalitarian structure known as the national security state and restore our original principles of liberty and free markets and limited government, that is the way we lead the world to the highest reaches of freedom that mankind's ever seen. Thank you very much.